Meanwhile, the South African government maintains that granting diplomatic immunity for some of the people who will be attending the upcoming BRICS summit in August has nothing to do with the possible attendance by Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who is wanted on an international criminal court arrest warrant. He is wanted for alleged war crimes committed in Ukraine, where Russian forces invaded last year. At the same time, the DA has confirmed it's going to approach the High Court to try and ensure that government is forced to act in line with its obligations as a signatory to the Rome Statute and detain Putin, as well as hand him over to the ICC should he land in South Africa. Let's talk about the situation now with international relations expert Ayesha Kajee. Ayesha, very good evening to you. Grateful for your time. Is this upcoming BRICS summit proving to be more trouble than it's worth for South Africa?
Possibly, although South Africa seems to be weathering it quite well, being very adamant that they will grant diplomatic immunity to other heads of state. And so I suppose they will extend that to Mr. Putin as well. But you may recall a few years ago, Temegile, when then President Omar al-Bashir of the Sudan was in South Africa, also on a state visit, and there were murmurs that some of the civil society organizations or citizens were planning to make a citizen's arrest in much the same way that happened with Mr. Pinochet in London years ago. And then Mr. al-Bashir left the country very, very quickly and covertly. So it will be interesting to see, firstly, if Mr. Putin does decide to attend. Secondly, if South Africa as a government will grant him diplomatic immunity, as they're saying they're granting to everybody attending the BRICS summit. And thirdly, whether even if the South African government, having granted him that diplomatic immunity, then decides not to arrest him despite being a signatory to the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court, which court is the court in which Mr. Putin is now wanted to face charges of war crimes. Even if the South African government doesn't do that, it'll be interesting to see if any civil society organization, or indeed even if individual citizens decide to make a citizen's arrest, and what the security repercussions of that might be.
Right. And does it all rest in, and I must say before we move on, that the International Relations Department was very quick yesterday to say that the granting of this immunity does not extend to President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. It's for various other people who are expected to be here. But as far as Putin's attendance, it would appear at this stage that it's pretty much been left to the Kremlin to decide whether he will come to South Africa in August or not. Is that wise, or do you expect, in fact, that behind the scenes, Pretoria and Moscow are having a slightly more nuanced, more different conversation about his potential attendance?
I would say they're definitely having a more nuanced conversation behind the scenes, and that's probably all to the good. Because, as I said, even if the South African government decides, well, yes, we're signatory to the ICC, but because he's a sitting head of state, we're going to grant him immunity, diplomatic immunity, to come and attend the BRICS summit. Even then, should a non-government entity, be that an individual or group of individuals or an organization, decide to attempt a citizen's arrest, then the South African government is going to have a very tricky situation on its hands.
Might there be implications then? Pardon me, please finish your point.
Sorry. I say then it's going to be a really tricky situation for the South African government to navigate both diplomatically and internally. So, assume firstly that Mr. Putin, as with most other heads of state, will be fairly heavily guarded. Assume that an individual or group of individuals or organizations decides to attempt a citizen's arrest. What happens in the ensuing scuffle? Does anybody get hurt? Is the arrest successful? And if the arrest is successful, South Africa, having granted him diplomatic immunity, is going to be in a very tough position, not only with regards to whether to hand him over to the ICC, but also with regards to how does one then prosecute or criminalize the attempt by the citizen or group of citizens or organization to make a citizen's arrest, which is, by the way, a legal thing.
But would the Russians want to put a friendly country, South Africa, in that position where it has to make that call?
Well, that's why I'm saying I would assume that there are very nuanced discussions going on behind the scenes between the Kremlin and Pretoria at this point. And I think that there may be pressure for Mr. Putin to perhaps send a second in command, an alternative, instead of attending the summit himself.
Might there be implications then for the BRICS group of countries? And how would they look at South Africa if indeed we either said to Putin, do not come, if you do, you will be arrested and handed over, and handed over to the ICC, or wait for him to arrive and indeed arrest him, which some have already said is the more unlikely of the scenarios?
Very unlikely scenario, given the long-standing friendship between the two countries. Very unlikely that Mr. Putin will arrive, whether he's granted diplomatic immunity or not. And I would suggest that he would only come if he's assured of that diplomatic immunity. But if he does arrive, and I find it highly unlikely that our government will make the arrest despite being signatory to the ICC statute, as I've said. But the other scenario which could play out, and I think possibly will be tried, given that there was quite a movement afoot to try it with Mr. al-Bashir. If that happens, that's a chance, a risk that neither the South African nor the Russian governments will want to take at this point, given also the balance of the war in the Ukraine at the moment, and the fact that South Africa has traditionally walked a fairly taut tightrope between maintaining its friendship with the Kremlin and yet still relying on Western countries, the global North, if you will, for deals like the trade deal AGOA, etc. And they won't want to jeopardize that.
Right.
So my gut feeling right now is that they're probably talking to the Kremlin and saying, please attend, but send an alternative. Do not attend yourself as head of state.
Ayesha Kajee, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight.